is Hani Salim and critical faculty. Today, I'm very honored to have a distinguished guest with us here today, with us, Dr. and Professor Krauss. Hello, Professor Krauss. How are you?
Hi, I'm pretty good. How are you doing over there on the other side of the world?
Yeah, down under. Yes. Well, first of all, I would like to apologize for my Dumb and Dumber style hair because I had to cut my own hair for the
Well,
last few weeks in
that's the way it
Australia.
works.
You know, we're locked down, so we can't
Yeah,
go anywhere at the moment. So it's
yeah,
interesting times. But
yeah,
look, I want you to introduce yourself to the audience. It's predominantly been watched by Middle Eastern audience in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, but also Middle Eastern people who live in Australia. So if you can say a few words about yourself, please.
Okay, well, I'm a theoretical physicist, cosmologist, worked on particle physics and the beginning and end of the universe and for a long time. I'm a theoretical physicist, but I'm also a writer, and I've written many books on science and nature and the universe for the public, and also been involved in issues associated with science and public policy and the relationship between science and religion. I filmed, in fact, a large part of a movie down under with my friend Richard Dawkins. It's called The Unbelievers, which you can see probably on Netflix or Amazon. I don't know. And so I've talked and written about a lot of these things as well, mostly because I'm interested in science and distortions of science. And really what I want people to understand is that the real universe is fascinating without all the nonsense. So I think that's where we'll go. Right now, I should say I run a foundation called the Origins Project Foundation, which is involved in educating people and connecting people with the most interesting sort of scientists, scholars, public intellectuals in the world. And we also run a podcast called the Origins Podcast with Lawrence Krauss, and it has a variety of people ranging from scientists, Nobel Prize winners to Noam Chomsky and most recently Stephen Fry, and we have a wide variety of people on there. So those are some of the things I do. My new book, which I might as well promote, it's not out yet, but it'll be out in Australia February 4th. It's called The Physics of Climate Change. I guess that's enough.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with your podcast, and I think we both have a commonality. I think we both like Ricky Gervais and his witty way of.
Yeah, and I was lucky that Ricky was one of my first guests. He agreed to want to be one of my first guests on the podcast. We went to London to film it, and
Right.
that was a lot of fun. If you can, it's free on YouTube now, so you can go see it now at our YouTube channel. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, let me start by sort of start a conversation with something that really interests the Muslim world, um,
Okay,
uh,
sure.
which has been developed by William Lane Craig with the Kalam cosmological argument. Obviously, it comes from the Ghazali philosopher of the golden era of Islam, who was doing his best, trying to postulate how I won't
Doing
really
his best
wrong.
at the time. Sure,
Yeah, it
that's the
was.
point. Is that
Yeah, I agree. But unfortunately, it's been taken over by modern
Mhm.
apologists to make it sound more than what it really is. So how did you find that conversation? And especially, I know you had a couple of debates with Muslims, and they've used the exact same argument to prove a different type of God.
Yeah, no, there was a Muslim apologist that I debated in London, and it was a very contentious event. And he was just like William Lane Craig. He used the same arguments. I had another sort of debate in Canberra in Australia, which was much more civilized. The speaker was not as refined in the jargon he liked to spout. William Lane Craig and this other guy like to pretend that they have a scientific basis for what they're talking about when they really don't. I think your point was well put. In fact, you put it really well when you said that these arguments were developed, in the Middle Ages by people who were trying to understand the world. So it was perfectly reasonable for them to come up with arguments. But the great thing is that we now have science and we know a lot more about the universe, and we don't have to invent arguments. I mean, the biggest problem to some extent with this argument is that sort of everything has a cause. Is that falls apart. For example, if the universe really began, if space and time are tied together, as we know they are in special and general relativity, then if the universe began, it could be that time itself began at the Big Bang, and time itself may not have a meaning before that. And of course, if there's no time before that, then you can't really talk about a cause, can you? I mean, we don't know if that's the answer, but that's one example of the fact that you have to you have to change the way you think about the world, because nature and science evolves, and we've evolved and discovered a lot since the Middle Ages.
Right.
Hold on one second.
Sure.
Alexa, turn on office light. I'll try and get some more light in there. There we go. As the afternoon show.
And let there be light.
Okay.
It's a new god there. So, do you actually think time is fundamental, or is it an emergent sort of a property of the start of the universe?
The answer is I don't know. I mean, right now, we don't know. Time and space are tied together, and to the extent that space is fundamental, time is. But time right now is primarily a parameter in physics. In all of physics except for general relativity, time basically is a quantity that is used to measure things, and it's. But in special general relativity, time and space are intimately tied together, and time seems different in the sense that we can go in a circle in space really easily. I can go to Melbourne and back, or Canberra and back, which I used to do every 2 weeks when my wife lived there, and but it's hard to do a circle in time. No one's ever done one that we know of, and so time seems different, but that could just be an illusion. But I think people worry about time too much in the sense that it's obvious. It's obvious in the sense of describing physical phenomena that for all intents and purposes, it's a fundamental quantity that describes when and where events happen. Really, that's all space and time are. It describes events, and events are what are important for the physical world. Because if there were no events, then you and I wouldn't be here talking.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. In your conversation with William Lane Craig, there were a series of 3 conversations, I think, in Australia, and they're quite interesting. But it was something very interesting to me. You've started with the notion, and I can feel it and sense it in your tone of voice, that you started with the notion that William Lane Craig is nothing but a dishonest charlatan who knows exactly.
He is.
And then somewhere else, slightly differently. Yeah.
Well, I don't mind just having discussions with people who I may disagree with and who may or may not be wrong, but at least have good arguments for what they're doing. But what upsets me is when people knowingly use whatever they can use, even if they know it's wrong, to promote a viewpoint. And I guess I was impacted, let me say, because about 2 weeks before the first of those 3 debates, and I warned the people in Australia who were very well-meaning. The people who put on that were a Christian group, but they were well-meaning, and I warned them about that. I had agreed to appear for them before I knew who they were going to bring along with to debate. And when they did suggest William Lane Craig, I warned them. But afterwards they apologized. But about 2 weeks before the first debate, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, the Unbelievers had not yet come out. The film had not yet appeared, and William Lane Craig did a podcast discussing the movie and all the things we did wrong in the movie when he couldn't possibly have seen it, in fact, and got things wrong. So I felt, and I brought along various clips and things, and I thought they gave an example. It's not, look, I don't like to call people out that way. It's not much fun, and then certainly in front of a big audience, it wasn't pleasant, and some people get upset. But I think with someone like that who tries to use sophisticated notion, tries to appear deeply interested in finding the truth, who on the other hand, I mean, William Lane Craig, personally he was not a bad guy or anything, but he represented what I think is the real problem with religion. Namely, he knew the answer, and then he tried to work backwards. He knew what the answer must be because it was in the Bible, and therefore whatever he worked backwards to had to get to that answer. And so if you know the answer before you ask the questions, you're always going to delude yourself. And I think that's the whole point about science, is you got to just keep asking questions and let nature tell you what the answer is, even if it goes somewhere you don't like. And often, in my experience as a scientist, I've asked questions and found out that nature would take me to a place I didn't want to go. But the universe doesn't exist because for us to like it or not.
Yeah. Talking about backwards arguments, the fine-tuning is a perfect candidate, because it seems to me that this argument is always used to show something that is worked backwards, because we only can exist in the world that we can exist in, but it's been used.
Yeah, I know, and it sounds like we seem to be very well tuned for the universe we live in, but that's not. But then to suggest that the universe is tuned for us rather than we're tuned for the universe is kind of putting it on its head. And I recently wrote a piece in a journal called Inference on cosmology, because it's been abused a lot, this notion of fine tuning. And the point is, it's not surprising to find that we can live in a universe in which we can live. But you know, the important thing is to realize that doesn't mean, I mean, if had the universe been different, it could be perfectly possible that life forms could exist in such a universe. And the example I used was, you know, if you were the only person on Earth and didn't know anything else, you might look down at your feet and be amazed that it was fine-tuned so your feet were exactly long enough to touch the ground.
Yeah.
Any shorter you'd be in the air, any longer you'd be underground. Well, of course, we understand that in a different context. And most of these fine-tuning arguments where something appears to be fine-tuned, in physics this has been the case for over 100 years. Something appears to be fine-tuned and strange, but later on we discover that there's a fundamental principle that makes it not so surprising at all.
Right. Obviously, when matters and energies first met in the universe, it ended up with the antimatter and the matter sort of annihilating each other, but you end up with that residual small quantity that creates all matters. And same as for the energy. You have a little bit more energy, but the best number you could have come up with to create more life is 0, but the number is slightly above 0.
Well, and that's the point. People say this. Look, the key point, which is the reason I wrote one of my books, because I was involved I was one of the, I guess, first people to argue it was there, is that empty space is full of energy. We don't know where that energy comes from. Let's make it clear. But the amount of energy, if you're a theoretical physicist, there are only 2 values that seem natural: 0 or a very large number. Because if you plug in the numbers for particle physics, the energy of empty space should be very large. Well, it's not 0 or very large. In fact, it's 120 orders of magnitude smaller than the number you might naively imagine. That sounds like fine-tuning. But what people don't realize is that so it's small. It's too small for us to understand right now. Hopefully we'll one day understand it. But if it had been smaller, then the universe would be better tuned for life. So it's not as if it's optimized for life. In fact, if it had been 0, it's probably better still. So it's consistent with the existence of life, but it's not as if it was fine-tuned to make life possible, because, as they say, it could have had a much more natural value, and life would have been even more predominant in the universe.
As a matter of fact, in 1998, you predicted something that won a couple of people the Nobel Prize in 2011, I believe. I believe you predicted that the energy is contained mostly in empty space.
Yeah, we predicted actually that in 1995, and then my friends, one of whom's in Australia, went out and not really, in fact, they didn't believe it. They were motivated for looking at something else, and I think they were extremely surprised to discover it was the case. And then they were very happy 10 years later to win the Nobel Prize for that discovery.
Yeah, it seems that it seems that most Nobel Prize winners are stumbling upon discoveries, just like the microwave background.
Well, some of them are, but that's why they're discoveries. If they weren't surprising, they wouldn't be discoveries. And they were experimentalists, they were observers. And in physics is an empirical science, and so most of the discoveries or prizes are given for experimenters, because for the good reason that it's experiment and observation that drive physics. Every now and then theorists get ahead of the experimentalists, and in any case, no one believed it when I argued there was, and a colleague of mine and I argued there was an energy of empty space. But so it took the experimenters to convince the world. Right.
Hey, before we start talking about nothing, William Lane Craig invoked Leibniz. Why there's something rather than nothing. Obviously, again, another person was trying to do his best, trying to understand. Obviously, the world seemed a lot mysterious back then, and came up with this particular phrase that for some reason sort of survived all the discoveries, and as if people started to ignore everything that we've discovered and stuck to these words because they seem strong and profound.
Why is that? But I use the same phrase as a subtitle of my book, Universe or Nothing, because it was a question, it's an issue that religious people have brought up over the ages, because reasonably, it's a very reasonable thing to argue, well, look, the universe it's full of stuff. How could it be full of stuff if it originally didn't have any stuff, or originally didn't even exist, without some supernatural being, without someone to create the stuff? So how could you have a universe with 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars? It sounds like you need something. And the great surprise, and what I wanted to convey in that book, one of the many things, was that in fact, in spite of the fact that it's not intuitive, you can create a universe with 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars. That can be created out of nothing, namely none of those things to begin with, without violating any laws of physics and without the requirement of having an external actor governing the situation. Just the laws of physics would allow it to happen. And that's surprising and shocking and remarkable. Such a remarkable result that I thought it was worth communicating to the world. But this phrase, why is there something rather than nothing, has caught on over the years because it really, I think, there are a few fundamental things that have led people to believe in God. And one is that you couldn't create a universe without a God. It seems intuitive that you need something to, let there be light, let it be matter, create the earth. And the point is the fact that physics shows us you don't need it is remarkable. And the other thing that I think is even more important maybe is that if you were to ask what would be the characteristics of a universe that arose spontaneously from nothing, from no universe, just by laws of physics, and lasted 14 billion years, which is roughly how long our universe has lasted, what would its physical characteristics be? And you look around and you find out they'd be exactly the physical characteristics of the universe we see. Now, that doesn't prove it's the case, but it's strongly suggestive.
Yeah. Well, it seems that theologians use the poetic and philosophical definition of nothing, which is basically the void of everything. But it seems that every time we look in especially in physics, there seems to be the notion of nothing doesn't actually exist. It seems to be like something that doesn't really exist.
Well, no, I wouldn't put it that way. I mean, and this is what's always hysterical to me, because people say, well, you're not really defining nothing properly. And I say, well, you define that. But the point is, if you look at how nothing was defined in the Bible, it's very vague. It's like, it's a vast, empty, nothingness, mainly empty space. Well, that's not nothing either, because we know empty space is full of particles and antiparticle, virtual particles that are popping into existence. And so when I actually work very, very hard in that book to specifically define what I mean by nothing with a series of different steps, they get angry because they say, now you're redefining nothing. And I say, well, you never had a good definition in the first place. But the main thing is that physics causes us to change our picture of things. And what we now realize is that the distinction between nothing and something is not as great as it was before, simply because out of nothing can come something. So, and by nothing in this case, let's say most simply empty space. Particles can pop into existence from out of empty space due to the laws of quantum mechanics and gravity. And so that distinction that seems so fundamental to the early theologians and philosophers isn't such a clear distinction anymore, and you have to be a little more careful. And also that, and the combination that the presumption in that phrase, why is there something rather than nothing? The word why is the key unfortunate word there, because why assumes purpose. It automatically, the assumption is purpose. It presumes purpose, and there may be no purpose. So the better statement is, how is there something rather than nothing, not why is there something rather than nothing. Because almost always when we say why, now we really don't mean purpose. Like, why is your heart located, where it is in your body? We don't mean well, why did someone put it there? We want to know how does your body work so that your heart most effectively works where it is, or whatever physical question we're asking.
Yeah, I always loved your answer when somebody asks you that question, which is because go to bed.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, the point is that look, I point out that our universe can be created from nothing. Namely, there was no universe, no space, no time, no matter, no radiation. And then they say, well, was there something anywhere else? And the answer is, I don't know. But you can keep asking why all the way down, like kids do, if you've had kids. And the only answer to that, to that long eternity of whys, is go to bed.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, those are maybe interesting questions, but they're not the questions that are relevant to trying to understand how our universe came into being, which is the question I wanted to answer.
Right. I think most people sort of make a mistake when they're trying to apply common sense to physics, and because they are not really that sort of intuitive. We've sort of evolved to understand things are medium sized, but we haven't evolved to understand things that are too small or too large. And
sorry to interrupt, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, physics has taught, if anything, that our common sense is suspect when it comes to trying to understand not just the universe on large and small scales, but sometimes even on human scales. We have to realize that sometimes the evidence of our perceptions are based on some kinds of illusions, and so we always have to be skeptical of ourselves. But certainly on the very small scales with quantum mechanics, the quantum mechanical world defies common sense, and it bothered people. It certainly bothered Albert Einstein. But the fact that it bothers us is just an indication of the fact that we evolved on a scale that didn't expose us to quantum mechanics. So our naive intuition is of a classical world, and it's not too surprising that the world as it actually is appears paradoxical, because our mental facilities never, it didn't evolve in a world in which those phenomena were manifest.
Yeah, indeed. Just the Kalam argument as well sort of predicated on the beginning, because the whole world bounce on the Big Bang and say, look, we've told you all along. It's all in Genesis. The universe has started. Einstein obviously believed in a steady state theory that the universe
originally.
Originally,
and then he threw it out when the data told him to throw it. And that's the wonderful thing about science. You can believe something with all your heart, but the minute the data tells you something else, you throw it out. That's the beauty of science. That isn't the beauty of religion.
Yeah, but correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Professor Krauss. The fact that the universe had a start doesn't mean it's the absolute start. It could have been a start on the back of a collapsed universe, or a cyclic one, or a
or it could be a start within a framework of space and time that already pre-existed, and in which many other universes are being created even as we speak. Are not being created, but are spontaneously appearing. And in fact, that's the picture we now have. That the most likely picture is that our universe is just one of a multitude of universes. And sure, that may be eternal, but our universe had a beginning, and it doesn't. So the fact that our universe has a beginning is not evidence for God. It's evidence of the fact that our universe had a beginning.
Right.
But just because it had a beginning doesn't mean it had to have a intelligent cause. As I've argued, the light that I just turned on there, the photons coming from there are due to electrons that are getting excited, but each electron emits a photon at random. Nothing causes it. We said probabilistically that will happen, but the photon exists now. It didn't exist before, and no intelligent person come and said, I think I'm going to create that photon.
Right. And I understand physics is trying to sort of simplify certain terms, but you guys don't speak like that. You speak in equations. Singularity, for example, when you talk about a singularity, it was no space for it to occupy, and there was no time for it to be. How long has it been sitting there for before it started to expand, or all these sort of terminologies before and after and where and when? They're completely nonsensical.
Well, they may not have any meaning, but I should point out, once you get to a singularity, then all of physics, as we know it, breaks down. But the nice thing about a universe popping into being from nothing is it can avoid a singularity. It could pop into being with a finite size. There were literally no space, no time. Suddenly, boom, you have a closed universe that has a specific size. Quantum mechanics and gravity suggest that's possible. So it's one way to avoid that strange singularity in general relativity where space becomes infinitely dense and everything breaks down. I think many of us think that that's just a mathematical artifact of a theory that really doesn't work down to that scale. Yeah. This is one way around it. But we don't know the answer, and I'm the first one to point out that what I've talked about is plausible based on what we know, but we don't yet have a theory, an exact theory. And I think it's fine for me to say that. But not having exact theory doesn't mean, people say, oh, well, you don't know exactly what's happening. Therefore, my postulate that some God created it is much more obvious and much more. Well, that's ridiculous, because mine requires no being whose complexity is never explained. And of course, the question that young kids often ask is, who created God?
Yeah, it always makes my day when I hear your criticism of the string theory about this guy who just came up and say, look, I think everything is about vibrations. Like, explain how. It's like, oh, I don't know. End of conversation.
Yeah, and exactly. Oh, that little cartoon. Yeah, no, it is. But I mean, it doesn't mean string theory is wrong. It just means we don't know. And as I keep saying, not knowing is fine. Not knowing is great. And it means because it means there's things to learn. There's two things about not knowing. One, it doesn't mean you're ignorant because there's a lot of things we do know about the universe. And two, it means doesn't mean you'll never know. Some people say you'll never understand the universe. You'll never understand love. And I say to myself, well, how do you know that? If you know we'll never understand it, then you must understand it. So you can never say never like that without the presumption that somehow you know more than anyone else knows. And so it's saying we don't know is just a humble, direct, and truthful statement. But it doesn't mean we'll never know. And science so far has been remarkably good over the last 500 years in breaking barriers.
Yeah. Professor Krauss, do you think a theory of everything is a myth? We shouldn't pursue it, and we should pursue a unifying quantum gravity theory, which is going to be probably our best ambitions for now.
Well, who knows? No, I look. I have no problem. I think it's unlikely they have it, but I think it. What I object to is claims that we already have one. String theorists early on in the 1980s were arguing that they had a theory of everything, and they certainly didn't. They had a theory that potentially might explain everything, but there's no evidence at the time that it did, and really there's no evidence since then that it does. And so I think it's unlikely that we may have a theory of everything, namely something that is. And by the way, a theory of everything really is a theory of very little, because when the theorists are talking about a theory of everything, they're talking about a theory that does what you just said, unifies gravity and quantum mechanics, and with the other four forces of nature. And really, that's only relevant to understanding the center of black holes or the beginning of the universe. But for everything else, for understanding how my iPhone works, I don't need a theory of everything. For understanding how oatmeal boils, I don't need a theory of everything. And so it's a nice goal to hope that we'll have one theory that describes the way the universe must be. But there's no evidence that we have such a theory, and so it's premature to argue about it. And it's better just to try and understand the universe a little bit better. And as Feynman said that, maybe the universe is like an onion with an infinite number of layers, and every day when he said he didn't matter, as long as he understood more tomorrow than he did today, he'd be happy.
Right. Do you actually think infinity is something that we can see in existence, or it's a mathematical interpretation?
Well, I don't think we can ever see infinity of that, but infinity is a mathematical quantity. The question is it realized in physical systems? In terms of a singularity, an infinitely dense point, I'm highly suspicious. On the other hand, could the universe be infinitely large? Potentially, and that's not physically impossible. But I'm not a big fan of infinities. Mathematicians like infinities more than physicists. In fact, it was getting rid of it. In fact, it was getting rid of infinities in the calculations that led people to string theory, because the quantum gravity in the canonical sense gives you a lot of infinities, which is one of the reasons why no one's sick. And string theory in a certain number of dimensions appears to get rid of those infinities, which is what got some people so excited.
Yeah. Do you still think the same way about philosophy? I know you're in the past. I'm actually philosophy trained, but I love physics and I love your work. But do you think, especially with the new way of approaching philosophy in a way that actually does something in the world, instead of just really having this sort of intellectual masturbation and not really coming up with anything, do you think there is an era where science and philosophy becomes more like a theoretical physics and where you can start postulating possibilities and try to find them in the real world?
Well, look, philosophy's always been intimately related to science. Science used to be called natural philosophy. It was an outgrowth of philosophy. I mean, what philosophy is very useful for, and people seem to think I have a thing against philosophy. I don't. We all do philosophy when we ask questions, because what philosophy is all about is learning how to frame questions very carefully, and then trying to make sure that you have a logical path to trying to resolve them. Those are two very important aspects of philosophy. And so philosophy is most important in science when something is needed to frame important questions that drive discovery. It was necessary in some sense in the early days of physics. It's been very useful or important probably in biology and particularly in consciousness where we don't understand it. But physics has proceeded to a point where the really important questions are really not asked by philosophers, because it's become so developed that in order to know what are the good questions to ask, there's a lot of intellectual baggage coming from physics that you need to know about. And so philosophy really at this point doesn't contribute, formal philosophy doesn't really contribute to driving what the questions that physicists ask. That doesn't mean it's not useful or interesting, but it doesn't drive the questions that physicists ask. And physicists aren't governed by what philosophers are saying. They don't read the philosophy of science or anything else. But that doesn't mean it's not important to ask those questions, and it doesn't mean that there aren't other fields where important, rigorous philosophical thinking cannot help push that scientific field forward. That's certainly the case. In artificial intelligence, for example, and in, as I say, in consciousness are examples where I think philosophical questions are important ones.
Yeah, some translations of the work of Einstein and Isaac Newton and even Stephen Hawking. Unfortunately, these gentlemen have invoked the name God. They don't mean the word God by God. God does not play dice, so we can know the mind of God. In the brief history of time by Hawking. Unfortunately, when you translate this into Arabic, it actually seems that these guys actually believed in a God.
Well, and Stephen Hawking was a vocal atheist. Let's make that quite clear, and maybe more so than me in some sense. So was Einstein in the sense of a class god. He had nothing but derogatory things to say about formal religion. When he talked about God, he meant order in the universe. But you're right. I mean, the point is, it's true whenever we talk about science at some level, we use words, and words have a common usage that's sometimes different than the usage in science. The word theory often evokes something very different for members of the public than it does for scientists. And so we have to realize whenever we are using words to describe the world, we're making an approximation. And unfortunately, it's been tempting for certain people to formalize their ideas and use the word God. But Einstein certainly was not, as people say, his God was the God of Spinoza, which is, even that is a little pushing it, but the idea of some order in the universe. He was fascinated, as we all are who are physicists. Somehow the fact that the universe is explicable is amazing. The fact that we can understand the way the universe works and it has governed by these beautiful, elegant mathematical laws is remarkable. And in some sense we admire that and we're in awe of that. But that's not God. Yeah. Well, for some people it is. I mean, if that's your God, that's fine. If your God is the fact that the universe is explicable, and that there's a mathematical order, if that makes you happy, that's fine with me.
Yeah, I apologize. His name now escapes my mind, but the British scientist, mathematician, I should say, who just won the Nobel Prize.
Roger Penrose.
Penrose, yeah, he's the co-worker with Stephen Hawking. Yeah. He seems to be in the last few years working a lot around consciousness.
Yeah, and I think it's nonsense.
What do you think of this? Is very strange.
It's nonsense. It's just nonsense. Yeah, not worth talking about.
Yeah,
it's unfortunate. I mean, Roger Penrose is a brilliant man, and I know him, and he actually helped. He was a partner of mine in a debate at Oxford against a group of philosophers on philosophy versus science. But I mean, he's a brilliant mathematician, but that doesn't mean he's right, and he's been wrong, unfortunately, more times than he's been right.
Right. Yeah. It's really interesting to me because I understand he's not a religious person. He's not pushing any religious agenda as such.
But he argues that somehow quantum gravity, that the brain is different than computers, and that quantum gravity is somehow an essential part of the way the brain works, and quantum and I just think there's no evidence of it, and it's just hokum at this point, and it's unfortunate. I mean, it was unfortunate already when he was pushing it, because he was a distinguished scientist, and now it's unfortunate because he has a Nobel Prize, and for many people that gives him a new imprimatur for the public. But the fact that he doesn't have a Nobel Prize doesn't make the idea any less silly.
Yeah. The last point I want to end with, and I'll give you the last, obviously, bit of words to talk to our audience about, is that partition that seems to be sometimes in brilliant minds, like Isaac Newton had that partition, where he can be, and he does in 18 months what a human being it would probably take multiple people to do in centuries, and then come up with the weirdest ideas. So do we have these partitions readily available, and those biases sort of pop in every now and then.
Well, look, I mean, first of all, you have to remember it's a secret, but I'll reveal it to you. Scientists are human beings, and human beings have many characteristics. They can, first of all, they can believe things that are opposite at the same, contradictory ideas at the same time. We're not fully rational beings. We're got, reason is the slave of passion, and so. Isaac Newton was crazy. He spent most of his time interpreting symbols from the Bible, and I like to say that if he spent more time doing physics, he would have been a great physicist. But as it was, he was one of the greatest physicists of all time, even though he only did it part-time. And he was a unique and amazing individual, and every now and then such individuals pop up. But just because someone is good at one thing doesn't mean that that's good at anything else. And by the way, just because someone's good at one thing doesn't mean you should believe everything they say about that thing, whether it's me or anyone else. We should all be skeptical. We should mostly be skeptical of ourselves. But just credentials or prizes do not imply that someone is always right.
Yeah, I mean,
Newton was amazing.
You're right. Einstein had horrible blunders towards the end of his career. He made big mistakes. And
well, he did. I mean, he did. Mostly because he was out of touch with experiment. And that's really what the real problem, in my opinion, with Einstein later life. He was so convinced his ideas were right that he didn't think about the progress of experimental science. Newton, on the other hand, was an experimental scientist as well as a theoretical one, but he was a singularity, if you forgive me using those words.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, he would have been in an insane asylum today. Newton. He was a strange dude.
Yeah, very true. Very true. That
he used to love to hang people. He was involved in the treasury in England, the exchequer in England, and one of his favorite things was hanging counterfeiters. So anyway.
Yeah. I mean, and you can see it's like you got what's the name of the guy of the evolution?
Darwin
and Wallace. Obviously, they're both discovered at the same time, but Wallace has gone completely wacko towards the end, and he's got.
Yeah, but he doesn't get credit. He doesn't get the credit sometimes he deserves. Wallace independently came up with a central idea of. I mean, Darwin built it into a much more profound and detailed empirical science. But Wallace had the idea of natural selection, and it's good that we mention his name now as well as Darwin, and the two of them corresponded. But you're right. I mean, look, I have a lot of friends who are many friends who are scientists, and they're all people, and they're very different, and some of them, they're scientists of all types, and I think that's unfortunate. People have this stereotype of a scientist, and it's wrong. There are scientists of all types. There are ones who are excellent mathematicians. There are ones who aren't. There are ones who are funny. There are ones who aren't. There are ones who have various predilections, and there are others that are quite normal. So it just depends.
Yeah. I really like to thank you so much for your time, and I would like you to end with if you are a young person in Egypt or Saudi Arabia and wanting to learn more about the world that you live in, and you want to sort of keep skeptic to the ideas that are coming around, what is your advice to young people in those countries to really find out the truth for themselves?
Well, first of all, you don't have to proclaim it. If it makes you unsafe, you should. I don't want people to be unsafe. But no one can stop you from thinking or asking questions in your own mind, and I guess that's the thing. Intellectually, don't be intimidated. Even if you have, even if the laws of your society require you to do certain things, in your mind you can wander freely. There's a German expression, the Gedanken sind frei. The thoughts are free. But more importantly, because of the internet, I mean, the internet has a lot of nonsense in it, but you can get access to information about physics and about the world. Just be careful when you look at various sources and see that the people you're getting the information from are credible in one way or another, and compare and make sure you're not listening just to wackos on the extreme. But for example, there was a young woman in Afghanistan who was just a teenager, and she wasn't allowed to go to school because she was female, and she taught herself English and calculus, and actually read one of my books, and ultimately was able to contact me, and happily we were able to ultimately, in that case, arrange for her to come to the United States and study physics, where she studied at my university. But she was able to learn a lot on the internet. There's a lot of good educational tools on the internet that people have access to, and I encourage people to go there. And of course, part of the one of the reasons I do things like this is so that they're on the internet and people have access. And I do that. I did during the pandemic, or first part of the pandemic, I on my YouTube channel I did something called 5-Minute Physics, which was a lot of short physics YouTube videos, just so people learn a little physics while they were at home, and people can look at those too.
I really like to thank you for the recent amount of energy you've been sort of being generous to provide. You've been appearing on different channels and helping young generations sort of understand things, and been very generous with your time today. And I'd like to thank you so much.
Well, look, I appreciate that. Thank you. It's a pleasure, and it's important for me to reach out, especially into the Muslim world as well, because I think it's access to information is really, really important, and I think it's important. And I don't mean anything. I think I want young people to ask questions and be thrilled about the universe the way it really is. And so, for me to be able to reach into a new audience is more interesting for me than preaching to the converted, as they say. So I appreciate your giving me, in some sense, some access to that audience, and I hope it's been useful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Krauss. I wish you a wonderful day.
Okay, thank you. And you too. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.